do the ancient writings, known as Zep Tepi, inscribed on this temple, clue to the existence of a much older, pre-Diluvian time in Egyptian history? Could there have been a time when gods walked among the humans on Earth? If this is true, what knowledge did they leave behind for us that we have barely scratched the surface of understanding?
As fascinating as the monuments in Egypt are to me today, my first journey in the 1980s, 1986, what I learned from the people, the Egyptians themselves, proved to be just as fascinating as the archaeological remnants. Because when I asked them what they believe the origin of the temple sites were in their own backyard, what they told me is that Egypt is much, much older than traditional archaeology has been led to believe, and that the ancient Egyptians did not even call themselves Egyptians. There was a time that Egypt was known as Kemet. When I came away from those early conversations, I think the phrase that stuck with me the most when I asked about who were these first people, the phrase that came across so many times were the words Zep Tepi, Zep Tepi. And what this literally translates into, it means the first time. And it strongly implies that Egypt has evolved over a period of cycles or phases, of which we are now seeing only the most recent, and that the indigenous people themselves acknowledge these early phases and proudly trace their ancestry back to Zep Tepi, to the first time.
In ancient Egypt, every temple, in theory, had what were known as foundation texts or building texts. And what these were is how the first ever temple in Egypt was established. And there was always a story that went with it to do with the beginnings of Egyptian civilization and the age of the gods, which was known as Zep Tepi, which is generally interpreted as meaning the first time or the first occasion. And the most complete form of this foundation story is found at Edfu in southern Egypt. We would only know about it for the work of Yves Raymond, who wrote an extraordinary book called The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple. And it's the only book to date that breaks down all of these foundation texts and shows that they're actually based on a real history of Egypt during what she describes as pre-dynastic times.
The Zep Tepi from the ancient Egyptian language means first time, and it is generally connected to the myth of Osiris. My studies started in the effort to confirm the existence of a last civilization which lived on the planet in the ancient time. The same civilization, in my opinion, that built the pyramid all around the world, not only in Egypt. And the timeline is 36,400 before Christ, when the monument of Giza and the sky were perfectly aligned according to the Thoth's Hermetic concept, as above, so below.
When we look at the current region we call Egypt, what we find based on the evidence left behind in ancient temples and structures is that there have been multiple civilizations that have risen and fallen throughout that region. And the area that is of most interest to us is looking at where it began. And where it began and when it began is based on a time period known as Zep Tepi.
Zep Tepi is an amazing time where it was said that the gods came down from heaven and turned mud into a kingdom. Now, what's interesting is Thoth claimed in the Emerald Tablets to have built the Great Pyramid. He said, I patterned this pyramid by Earth's force so that it would remain through the ages. And he also is the builder of Giza, or the master architect of Giza itself.
Zep Tepi was considered the golden age. It was the age of the gods. It was the time where everything worked really well. People were virtuous. They were really in connection with source and higher powers and spirits. But it's also during this period where we find some of the very early construction around on the planet. And so in Egypt, we find the pyramids, where even today we can't figure out how they did it. And one of the things that's interesting is as you survey around the world, there are pyramids all over the place. But when you look at these other pyramids, they're all step pyramids. They're all made out of smaller stones. They're not nearly as big as the ones that you find in Egypt. And so it tells you that there was superior technology happening in Egypt, and around the world, these other cultures were trying to imitate that technology in those areas.
Is it possible most historians have completely underestimated the timeline? That more than 36,000 years before Common Era, there was a sophisticated culture in the Nile Delta region we now know as Egypt. Robert Bauval, the Egyptian-born author, has been providing intriguing insights on the Giza Plateau since the publication of his first book, The Orion Mystery, in 1994.
So there's an interesting correlation that Robert Bauval found between the placement of the pyramids on Giza and the belt stars of Orion. Now remember, Orion is actually a very important constellation to the Egyptians, to the ancient Egyptians, because he represented Osiris, which is the god of the afterworld and renewal. Now, one thing that Robert Bauval noticed is that if we were to look at the belt stars of Orion today, they don't quite match up exactly where the pyramids are. So he did some working and he found out that 10,500 BC, those stars almost exactly aligned with the pyramids, right where they needed to be. And this was the foundation of his Orion correlation theory. What's even more fascinating is he found out not only did those three belt stars of Orion match the location of those pyramids, but we're looking at heaven on earth, as above, so below, that the ancient Egyptians, as they were designing the Giza Plateau in the time of Zep Tepi, they wanted to match the heavenly bodies on the earthly bodies so that there was a direct correlation of the celestial beings to the earthly beings. Also, what Bauval noticed was that in the year 10,500, that the placement of the Sphinx on Giza also matched the location of Leo. And he went, that's very interesting, because 10,500 was also the age of Leo. And what the age of Leo is on the vernal equinox, the rising sun comes up in the constellation of Leo. And they wanted to denote that this was a very important time period.
Robert Bauval is one of the most important researchers ever, because he earned the great merit in opening a new way of investigation of the mysteries of Giza and of the pyramids. Because for the first time in the history, he introduced a model of analysis, and that gave us the opportunity to understand and to study the Giza paradigm from a different point of view. Now, observing the astronomical map at 10,500 before Christ, I noted a key point. The Orion constellation is not perfectly aligned with the pyramids. If we assume that the Zep Tepi is an ancient time during which the gods lived on Earth, we must also say that on the Giza Plateau somewhere there is a monument that refers to the star Sirius, in connection with the goddess Isis.